All right, let's jump over and talk about the Cincinnati Bengals and the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, if there was a game that isn't very interesting in fantasy, but is way more interesting in real life, probably more this one, although there are plenty of good fantasy plays here. You know, 2 0-2 teams here with a lot of promise coming in. Joe Burrow looks legit, but he hasn't gotten his first win yet, whereas the Eagles, I mean, ever since that second quarter against Washington when Carson Wentz threw the interception near the end of the first half, they basically have been one of the worst, if not the worst team in the NFL on offense. They just have not looked good. Carson Wentz has just been straight up bad. So something's got to give here. Obviously, one of these teams are going to come away with a dub. Who's it going to be? Well, Vegas thinks it's the Eagles, but they're not ultra confident in it. 5-point spread here, over under a 46. So, middle to higher on the week. Implied point total here is the Eagles getting about 25.5 versus the Bengals 20.5. Now, the Bengals have not given up a lot of points to quarterbacks, but bear in mind, they played Tyrod Taylor in week 1, who didn't really do anything. We saw the Bengals get absolutely torched by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb last week. And, even though they've given up the 30th most points to receivers, we saw Odell Beckham have a nice day against them last week, moderate against the tight end, whereas the Eagles have actually been pretty average across the board. They've been okay at stopping the wide receivers. Again, in week 1, playing against Washington, there wasn't a lot going on for them offensively that game, whereas last week, we saw them kind of shut Robert Woods down, but Cooper Kupp had a nice game, so I'm not really buying that this team is a strong defensive team against the receivers. I think they're just kind of mediocre all around. Their run defense has not been what it used to be, at least from what we saw last year. And they're giving up a lot of points to tight ends as well. We just saw Tyler Higbee absolutely torch the Eagles last week and throw up 3 touchdowns. So what does that mean here? Well, we're going to start our studs. I mean, that should just be the norm from this point. I'm confident in Mixon. The Eagles' run defense does not look anywhere near as imposing as it used to be, and especially if they're getting a lot of good distance. If Carson Wentz continues his turnover bug, Mixon should have a much better chance at scoring in this one, hopefully get a couple scores for you. But I'm confident in Mixon. I haven't lost faith in him yet. He's looked decent. The offensive line has not. Hopefully they can get a little bit more cohesion going on there, but Mixon involved a bit more in the passing game last week as well. Giovanni Bernard has been a bit of a pain for fantasy, but I think Mixon will have a better week this week. With Tyler Boyd, this game could end up being a higher scoring affair. Both of these defenses here kind of shaky. We're expecting both of these teams to at least be able to move the ball against one another, so Tyler Boyd could actually see a lot of work. We saw last week, he led the team in fantasy points. Didn't lead the team in targets. That was AJ Green. AJ Green has received some of the most targets and I believe the most air yards of any receiver in the NFL right now, but he has done very little with it. So that is my main concern with AJ Green right now, is at what point is he actually going to turn things around and look like AJ Green again? Because up to this point, he's really just looked stale. He definitely looks like a guy that hasn't been on the field in over a year. And the real question now is, does he turn it around, or is this just who he is? And if this is who he is, they're going to eventually pivot away from him. So I am comfortable starting him because of the amount of targets he's received in the red zone, the amount of high leverage targets he's gotten. Like, he was very close from having a phenomenal game last week if he would have been able to pull in like 2 or 3 of those catches that he just seemed to drop. So if at any point he turns things around in the middle of the game, you're going to regret benching him. This is kind of the last week for me. If Green can't put up anything against the Eagles, he's going to go on my bench until further notice. But I think you can start him one last time, because with the amount of work that he's getting, eventually something's got to break through for Green. And we'll learn this week whether or not Green is going to be doing anything this year. Burrow, I guess you could talk me into starting him just based on the kind of performances that the Eagles have given up to the quarterbacks thus far, but I feel like there's probably better options out there for you. And the Drew Sample is interesting. Like I mentioned before, we already saw Tyler Higbee throw up 3 touchdowns on the Eagles last week, so maybe Drew Sample is a good play for you this week. Probably not someone I'm jamming into my lineup unless I have to, but if you're in a deeper league, or you lost, I guess there weren't really many tight ends that went down this last week, but if you just haven't been happy with your tight end options, Drew Sample is an interesting play this week. And then we're not playing Bernard. We're not playing any of the other receiving options here because no one's getting consistent enough targets outside of Boyd and Green to really warrant looking at here. Now, on the Eagles side, Miles Sanders is pretty much the lone bright spot of this offense right now. He truly was a bell cow last week, and even in a game that they lost, was heavily involved, still had a really nice fantasy day. Like I mentioned before, we saw the Bengals get absolutely murdered by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb last week. I'm looking forward to seeing what Miles Sanders does, firing him up in all formats. Great DFS play this week as well. Now, with Jalen Reagor getting hurt, I think that just means that they're going to rely even more on their tight ends. So, of course, you're starting Ertz and Goedert. Like, that should just be a given at this point because they're pretty much the target leaders across the board, and it's been that way for a while, and it's probably going to remain that way. Eagles defense is interesting here. Playing at home, it definitely have the chance for Joe Burrow to make some rookie mistakes, but not someone you have to jam into your lineup. I just feel like they're probably pretty low owned right now. So if all the other good plays are gone, they might be someone you can sneak off the waiver wire for free. There's no way I'm starting Carson Wentz until he shows us that he's gained his confidence back. I mean, at this point, we're on Jalen Hurts watts. So hopefully Carson Wentz can, rebound against the Bengals as Baker Mayfield did last week. We'll see. In terms of his receiving options, Desean Jackson could have a decent game, but he hasn't looked like himself. Greg Ward, probably not someone you really want to throw out there unless you're in like the deepest of leagues. I'm not playing Arcega-Whiteside. Alshon Jeffrey is still a few weeks from returning. We'll see whether Jalen Reagor comes back in 2 or 6 weeks. I've heard both reports at this point. So just kind of a mess outside of the running back and tight end situation there for the Eagles. And we're not playing Boston Scott. He was definitely just a sprinkle workload kind of guy. He was not seeing any significant touches last week. And in a game where Sanders was coming back from an injury, you thought maybe they'd ease him back into the workload. Not at all. He was truly the bell cow. So I'm going to give my vote of confidence here to the Eagles. I'm going to trust Vegas on this one, although I think that this game is a bit closer. I got the Eagles by 3, winning 28-25. So there should still be some fantasy goodness in this one. And while there's probably going to be mistakes aplenty, I think that there's enough going on here where there's going to be some good fantasy options going.